All that sort of cookery has been invented by French and German doctors, and I should like to hang them for having done so. They go and prescribe diet and a hunger cure, as though what suits their flaccid German systems will agree with a Russian stomach. Such devices are no good at all." Sobakevitch shook his head wrathfully. "Fellows like those are forever talking of civilization, as if that sort of thing was civilization. Phew!" Perhaps the speaker's concluding exclamation would have been even stronger had he not been seated at table. "For myself, I will have none of it. When I eat pork at a meal, give me the whole pig; when mutton, the whole sheep; when goose, the whole of the bird. 2 dishes are better than 1,000, provided that one can eat of them as much as one wants." And he proceeded to put precept into practice by taking half the shoulder of mutton onto his plate, and then devouring it down to the last morsel of gristle and bone. "My word," reflected Chichikov, "the fellow has a pretty good holding capacity." "None of it for me," repeated Sobakevitch as he wiped his hands on his napkin. "I don't intend to be a fellow named Plushkin, who owns 800 souls, yet dines worse than does my shepherd." "Who is Plushkin?" asked Chichikov. "A miser," replied Sobakevitch. "Such a miser as never you could imagine. Even convicts in prison live better than he does, and he starves his servants as well." "Really?" ejaculated Chichikov, greatly interested. "Should you, then, say that he has lost many peasants by death?" "Certainly. They keep dying like flies." "Then how far from here does he reside?" "About 5 versts." "Only 5 versts?" exclaimed Chichikov, feeling his heart beating joyously. "Ought one, when leaving your gates, to turn to the right or to the left?" "I should be sorry to tell you the way to the house of such a cur," said Sobakevitch. "A man had far better go to hell than to Plushkin's." "Quite so," responded Chichikov. "My only reason for asking you is that it interests me to become acquainted with any and every sort of locality." To the shoulder of mutton there succeeded, in turn, cutlets, each one larger than a plate, a turkey of about the size of a calf, eggs, rice, pastry, and every conceivable thing which could possibly be put into a stomach. There the meal ended. When he rose from table, Chichikov felt as though a pood's weight were inside him. In the drawing-room the company found dessert awaiting them, in the shape of pears, plums, and apples, but since neither host nor guest could tackle these particular dainties, the hostess removed them to another room. Taking advantage of her absence, Chichikov turned to Sobakevitch, who, prone in an armchair, seemed, after his ponderous meal, to be capable of doing little beyond belching and grunting. Each such grunt or belch necessitated a subsequent signing of the cross over the mouth, and intimated to him a desire to have a little private conversation concerning a certain matter. At this moment the hostess returned. "Here is more dessert," she said. "Pray have a few radishes stewed in honey." "Later, later," replied Sobakevitch. "Do you go to your room, and Paul Ivanovitch and I will take off our coats and have a nap." Upon this the good lady expressed her readiness to send for feather beds and cushions, but her husband expressed a preference for slumbering in an armchair, and she therefore departed. When she had gone, Sobakevitch inclined his head in an attitude of willingness to listen to Chichikov's business. Our hero began in a sort of detached manner, touching lightly upon the subject of the Russian Empire, and expatiating upon the immensity of the same, and saying that even the empire of ancient Rome had been of considerably smaller dimensions. Meanwhile Sobakevitch sat with his head drooping. From that Chichikov went on to remark that, according to the statutes of the said Russian Empire, which yielded to none in glory, so much so that foreigners marvelled at it, peasants on the census lists who had ended their earthly careers were nevertheless, on the rendering of new lists, returned equally with the living, to the end that the courts might be relieved of a multitude of trifling useless emendations which might complicate the already sufficiently complex mechanism of the state. Nevertheless, said Chichikov, the general equity of this measure did not obviate a certain amount of annoyance to landowners, since it forced them to pay upon a non-living article the tax due upon a living. Hence, our hero concluded, he, Chichikov, was prepared, owing to the personal respect which he felt for Sobakevitch, to relieve him, in part, of the irksome obligation referred to. In passing, it may be said that Chichikov referred to his principal point only guardedly, for he called the souls which he was seeking not dead, but non-existent. Meanwhile, Sobakevitch listened with bent head, though something like a trace of expression dawned in his face as he did so. Ordinarily, his body lacked a soul, or, if he did possess a soul, he seemed to keep it elsewhere than where it ought to have been, so that, buried beneath mountains, as it were, or enclosed within a massive shell, its movements produced no sort of agitation on the surface. "Well?" said Chichikov, though not without a certain tremor of diffidence as to the possible response. "You are after dead souls?" were Sobakevitch's perfectly simple words. He spoke without the least surprise in his tone, and much as though the conversation had been turning on grain. "Yes," replied Chichikov, and then, as before, softened down the expression, "dead souls." "They are to be found," said Sobakevitch. "Why should they not be?" "Then, of course, you will be glad to get rid of any that you may have chance to have?" "Yes, I shall have no objection to selling them." At this point the speaker raised his head a little, for it had struck him that surely the would-be buyer must have some advantage in view. "The devil!" thought Chichikov to himself. "Here is he selling the goods before I have even had time to utter a word. And what about the price?" he added aloud. "Of course, the articles are not of a kind very easy to appraise." "I should be sorry to ask too much," said Sobakevitch. "How would 100 roubles per head suit you?" "What, 100 roubles per head?" Chichikov stared open-mouthed at his host, doubting whether he had heard aright, or whether his host's slow-moving tongue might not have inadvertently substituted one word for another. "Yes. Is that too much for you?" said Sobakevitch. Then he added, "What is your own price?" "My own price? I think that we cannot properly have understood one another, that you must have forgotten of what the goods consist. With my hand on my heart do I submit that 8 grivni per soul would be a handsome, a very handsome offer." "What? 8 grivni?" "In my opinion, a higher offer would be impossible." "But I am not a seller of boots." "No, yet you, for your part, will agree that these souls are not live human beings." "I suppose you hope to find fools ready to sell you souls on the census list for a couple of groats apiece?" "Pardon me, but why do you use the term 'on the census list'? The souls themselves have long since passed away, and have left behind them only their names. Not to trouble you with any further discussion of the subject, I can offer you 1.5 rubles per head, but no more." "You should be ashamed even to mention such a sum. Since you deal in